Hey, everybody. So, welcome to part one of this kind of series of lectures that are going to be about something called materialism, and more broadly, this idea of marginality as a source of knowledge. And what we're going to kind of do as we move forward is start with some of the first materialism, which is coming from Karl Marx, is called historical materialism. And rather than focusing on a lot of, communism or anything, Marxism more broadly, we're really going to focus in on the method Marx used, and kind of the way he went about thinking, and use that and track how that has developed over time. So, what Marx did was start from a very specific premise, a real premise, that there are people in this world and that we need to use their lives as a source of philosophy. And he pitted that against something that had come before that, which broadly speaking comes from the Hegelian tradition. What that is not all that important for you to understand. What it is important to get is that it was a form of idealism, and it was a very rationalist perspective on philosophy. So we're thinking back, it has a lot to do with the rationalism of Plato, or what we talked about with the state of nature, in this time coming from the German context. So, what you're reading from is an excerpt on what historical materialism is from the German ideology, which is one of Marx's. Actually, it's a collaboration effort between Marx and Engels. Engels and him did a lot of co-writing together, and it really does try to clearly lay out what they were doing from a philosophical perspective in terms of how they went about making their argument. So it's called the German ideology because of its opposition to previous forms of Hegelianism, um, broadly speaking, previous forms of German idealism. And so here is sort of a starting point that we come to in the excerpt you read. And there's going to be a lot of me reading quotes here. I'm going to try and do that in a way that's interesting, but I apologize. Later on, it's mostly because I don't want to do a lot of speaking for the literature I've chosen. So I want to let the literature and specifically Black lesbian women speak for themselves. That's kind of why I'm going about doing this way. I know it's boring. I'm sorry. Um, but here is where Marx starts. So since, according to their fantasy, the relationships of men, and by there he means German idealism, the young Hegelians, he talks about that right here, actually. So they're, the Hegelians' fantasy, the relationships of men, all their doings, their claims and their limitations are products of their consciousness. The young Hegelians logically put to men the moral postulate of exchanging their present consciousness for human, critical, or egoistic consciousness, and thus removing their limitations. That's a lot to unpack, but all he's really saying is that what German philosophy up to this point, up to Marx, kind of talks about is how the products of lives, the products of ideas, and more broadly, the German ideology as Marx wants to present it, frames individuals and their lives, their interactions as a product of their consciousness, their ideas about the world. And that means it's above us, and there's something above us, collectively speaking, that is our collective consciousness. Hegel will call this a Geist, a spirit. And that spirit is something that we can kind of hone in on, correct, and in doing so, build a better nation. So Hegel's project is about getting spirit to its ultimate form and a progression of spirit that makes the world a better place, that ends in the perfect German state, which at this point in time is very concerning. So there are things to be concerned about here with Hegel's project. The young Hegelians, so what they're doing is trying to get us into the correct spirit that can better um, shape, form, and mold what is this emerging German nation. Germany was one of the last countries to actually unify, so it was a relatively young nation. And so they're coming to terms with what it means to be German, which again, concerning. This part about removing their limitations, again, the critical or egoistic consciousness, again, it's getting into the right Geist. There was a left Hegelian and a right Hegelian group, and the left wanted the critical, the right wanted the egoistic. And they both kind of were critical of existing consciousness going on, and they wanted a better spirit to shape and mold the German population. And hopefully that would remove their limitations and create, a profitable, a very prosperous nation. This demand to change consciousness amounts to a demand to interpret reality in another way, i.e., to recognize it by means of another interpretation. So all this is saying really is that this demand to change consciousness is actually a demand to change the way people think. And one of the things Marx is trying to get into here is that there is a specific way of thinking that already exists and that we need to recognize, draw from, and kind of expand. So the young Hegelian ideologists are the staunchest conservatives. It has not occurred to any one of these philosophers to inquire into the connection of German philosophy with German reality, the relation of their criticism to their own material surroundings. So this is just a question. Why has Germany not thought about the lived experiences of individuals and stuck to a rational attempt to create what is an ideal German state? And this gets us to a broader set of questions that are really important to what Marx is trying to do and what the other people will read today or this week are trying to do. So as who writes philosophy and why does this matter? So who writes philosophy? Well, it's frequently in the academy and white men like me in the academy, to be more specific. And that shapes the way that we have created philosophy over time. Who philosophy is for, it shapes what philosophy means to different groups of people. And that's something that Marx is really trying to make sure we think about critically. So what does this get into? Well, it gets into this idea of epistemic ignorance and epistemic advances, which are going to be kind of building blocks for today. What is epistemic ignorance? Well, it's this idea that dominant knowledge perspectives, like rational philosophy, like Hegel, like Plato, that kind of thing, oftentimes exclude marginalized people from inquiry, fail to recognize marginalized perspectives as different, useful, as important. This is, as in Western science and its relationship to perhaps indigenous knowledge, which is what we'll end on. There's often an attempt to bring indigenous knowledge through science. And that oftentimes fails to give it its uniqueness and its actual utility as in a way of seeing the world. Dominant knowledge perspectives often produce theories that may render the things that marginalized populations do invisible. If we're looking at Marx himself going through this process of creating a new kind of perspective, he also fails to really talk about household labor and how that matters in terms of how women and other caregivers are integrated into capitalism. So even when we have these types of new forms of knowledge, these critical perspectives, oftentimes within them, there is the same epistemic ignorance going on. And we'll see that over time as we move along. They may denigrate things like feminine cognitive styles. Difference may be denigrated because it's not conforming to the dominant perspective. They may produce theory that renders marginalized populations as inferior or subordinate. And they may produce knowledge that is not relevant for marginalized populations or reinforces existing dynamics in society, existing power hierarchies. And what is really going on in terms of epistemic ignorance is the idea of what I'll call false universals. And false universals are the idea that Hegel had, that Kant had, that Plato had, that there's a transcendental subject. And that subject is reflective of all human beings. And understanding that subjectivity will help us understand a larger project, which is the Western Enlightenment. And the point being that that subjectivity is limited and is not all that reflective of a very diverse array of people. So what does Marx do? Well, he engages in something called historical materialism. And so he begins from the idea that we exist as individuals. And importantly, the first premise that he'll start with, and I'll talk about this, I'll reinforce this, is just that human beings exist and they produce their means of subsistence. They go out into the world, and that act of getting food, shelter, and clothing is a historical act. It's the first historical act. And from there, we can kind of think more about human populations. Um, this premise is empirically, not rationally situated. So it's empirical. He's talking about in any human condition, we have to go out and survive. That's a starting point from which we begin to think about human populations. From there, he kind of talks about our social relationships and how they matter. And it then gets into the division of labor. In terms of his social relationships, there's a lot of similarity here to Rousseau. So we have language. Language is an inherently social act for Marx. So we have it to interact with one another. We have it to think with others. And this means that as society gets more and more complex, the relationships between people and the interdependencies between people change. He talks about the division of labor and makes this important point, again, going back to his opposition to forms of German idealism, that the core the core element, the core aspect of the division of labor that matters for our purposes in modern societies, and where it really gets to be a antagonistic division. So when it begins to create two sides that are in opposition to one another, what Marx kind of calls the social dialectic. So that's when you have classes that are antagonistically opposed in terms of their interests and in terms of their resources in society. What matters in modern societies is this key distinction between manual and intellectual labor. So the separation from what we might call production, the process of getting by, of subsisting in society, and this process of creation, intellect, this process of philosophy. So the philosophers can use this perspective to get people to change their thinking because of the division of labor, because they're given the chance to think, to read, to spend time and intellectually contemplate the world. And so what does Marx do? Well, he writes from the vantage point of the proletariat class. The proletariat class is the working class. And he searches for antagonisms that kind of boil up to the fore in society, and in many ways tries to read history through those antagonisms. So what is the key antagonism? I think that's right. Sounds wrong for me. Is this between the proletariat, the working class, and the bourgeoisie. So who are the bourgeoisie in Marxist terminology? It's a sociologically defined social class, especially in contemporary times, referring to people with a certain cultural and financial capital, belonging to the middle or upper middle class, the upper haute bourgeoisie, the middle moyenne bourgeoisie, and then the petite bourgeoisie. They're collectively designated, and they are an affluent and often opulent stratum of the middle class who stand opposite to the proletariat class. Who are the proletariat? Well, they are the social class of wage earners, those members of society whose only possession of significant economic value is their labor power. So they don't have the same resources, intellectual and other forms of capital that allow them to do more in society than others would. Another key element of this is that Marxist philosophy considers the proletariat to be oppressed by capitalism, forced to accept meager wages in return for operating the means of production, which belongs to the bourgeoisie. So the means of production are outside of the reach of the proletariat. The bourgeoisie has the means of production, which here we can kind of think of as capital. So what is historical materialism? Well, I'm going to talk about four premises that kind of get us to a fifth. And the first premise, as I've already mentioned, is that there are living human beings, they exist, and they have to fulfill their means of subsistence. And so what comes out of this is the first fact to be established is how is their physical organization, how men are human beings are physically organized in society to fulfill their needs, to fulfill the means of production, to obtain a livelihood, to survive. So what determines how this is, or yeah, so how that set of social relationships are organized is central. And we'll see that this changes over time. So there's a couple points here. This depends on their relationship to their natural conditions. So how advanced society is technologically, the development of the division of labor, how advanced in terms of a society, the society is. And what this means is leads us to the second premise, that the first historical act, the act of going out into the world and making our lives, of shaping nature to our benefit, this creates a second fact, which in a second historical act, which is that the first historical act produces newer and newer needs. So as we go out and produce needs, there's a creation of demand for new things, and that creation of demand leads to the creation of dependency. So it leads to interaction with others. Um, what are the other premises? Well, as society develops, as our demand for new things develops, as our dependencies develop, it changes the way our social relations exist in the world. And so the third premise is that men who daily make their own lives begin to make other men, that is, engage in the propagation of the species, and thus um, this leads to the insertion of the family into social relationships. So the family as is first only a social relationship, a way of situating dependencies, a way of organizing society. Therefore, it's also tied to the means of production. And as more needs arrive and the division of labor expands, family becomes subordinate. So there becomes a breadwinner. And that breadwinner is the male head of the household, goes out and makes a living, and the rest of the family, women, children, exist in subordinate relationships. And therefore, this is again important, Marx is highly empirical. We must analyze the family from existing empirical data. We can't think about the family as someone like Rousseau did and push it into a distant past. We need to think about how the family exists in any given society as it exists. And this leads us to, I'm sorry, I'm jumping all over the place, uh, to the fourth premise, which is now production of material life appears as a double relationship. So as society expands, a double relationship emerges with the first historical act, the production of material life. And that double relationship is a natural relationship. That is, it's natural for us to go out and make our lives in the world, to make nature to our benefit. That's a natural relationship, but it's also a social a social relationship as it develops. And therefore, there's a need to interact to produce material life. And so what does this mean? Well, it means that the mode of production is always connected to a specific mode of social interaction. And therefore, that mode itself is also a productive force. So how society is organized is a productive force, just like how the means of production are organized. They both serve purposes to maybe control, to repress the proletariat class. And history should be connected to the history of both. That is the history of industry, of attaining the means of production, and the history of exchange, how we trade, barter, and distribute the means of production throughout society. And the point here is not that these are inherent to human history, but they change, but they are in the world outside of our consciousness of it. So they exist as something that we can't necessarily know from a rational starting point, a rational consciousness. And so what does this mean? Well, consciousness for Marx is never pure. It's never outside of ourselves. It's in ourselves and produced by us. So from the start, consciousness is afflicted with being burdened by matter. There's no realm of forms that Plato kind of thinks about, or spirit that can be differentiated from us as producers of it. So we create consciousness as a collection through our individual projection of consciousness. So practical consciousness is just language. We gain consciousness through language to interact and obtain the means of subsistence, to produce material life. And therefore, language is inherently social, and from the beginning, always a social product. So that is the historical materialism that I wanted us to get started with. And what I want to kind of, I guess, summarize here, we'll talk about socialism and maybe the Communist Manifesto more broadly later on in the semester. But what I wanted to get out of here is that what Marx does is start from the vantage point of the poorest element of society, the working class, those oppressed by capitalism, and sees the way that they think about the world, their knowledge, as an important and useful idea to understand the world. So he talks about the epistemic ignorance of the working class and uses the epistemic advantage of the working class vis-a-vis their relationship to capitalism as a way of understanding capitalism. So what are some takeaways? The division of labor as only truly such when a distinction between intellectual and manual labor emerges. So we couldn't get German idealism without the division of labor and the presence of social capital that directly oppresses other people in society. And real history occurs independently from intellectual history. So we need to study real things rather than engaging in this process of intellectual history. And he talks about how the division of labor and private property are identical expressions, right? There's inherent antagonism between the proletariat and the intellectual classes. The division of labor asserts an activity that is the creation of non-manual labor that the private property asserts as the end of that activity. So why is there a division of labor? To pursue private property, and the distribution of that is wildly unequal. And that's kind of the starting point for how Marx sees the world. So I hope that was helpful a little bit, and I might redo this one, but thank you for listening.